acromial end, coracoid process, head of humerus, humerus, clavicle, sternal end, costal cartilage, rib, ulna, radius, carpal bone, metacarpal bone, phalanges, coracoid process, superior border, supraspinatus fossa, infraspinatus fossa, scapula notch, acromion, spine of scapula, glenoid cavity, lateral border, subscapular fossa, medial border, acromial end, interior, posterior, sternal end, conoid tubercle, subclavian groove, costoclavicular ligament impression, sternal end, lesser tubercle, greater tubercle, intertubercular groove, deltoid tuberosity, radial fossa, lateral epicondyle, capitulum, head of humerus, anatomical neck, surgical neck, coronoid fossa, medial epicondyle, trochlea, radial groove, olecranon fossa, trochlear notch, coronoid process, interosseous border, olecranon process, ulna, head of ulna, styloid process, radial notch, head of radius, neck of radius, radial tuberosity, radius, ulna notch of radius, annular ligament of radius, interosseous membrane, proximal radioulnar joint, oblique cord, ulna, distal radioulnar joint, phalanges, metacarpals, distal phalanx, middle phalanx, proximal phalanx, hamate, pisiform, triquetrum, lunate, capitate, head of metacarpal bone, body of metacarpal bone, base of metacarpal bone, sesamoid bone, trapezoid, trapezium, scaphoid, acromion, subacromial bursa, infraspinatus, glenoidal labrum, teres minor, glenoid fossa, glenoid fossa, supraspinatus, supraspinatus, right common carotid artery, right common carotid artery, right subclavian artery, right subclavian artery, axillary artery, axillary artery, interior circumflex humeral artery, interior circumflex humeral artery, posterior circumflex humeral artery, posterior circumflex humeral artery, deep brachial artery, deep brachial artery, brachial artery, brachial artery, radial recurrent artery, radial recurrent artery, radial artery, radial artery, principal artery of thumb, principal artery of thumb, ulnar recurrent artery, ulnar recurrent artery, ulnar artery, ulnar artery, deep palmar arch artery, deep palmar arch artery, superficial palmar arch artery, superficial palmar arch artery, digital artery, digital artery, right external jugular vein, right external jugular vein, right subclavian vein, right subclavian vein, right brachiocephalic vein, right brachiocephalic vein, axillary vein, axillary vein, cephalic vein, cephalic vein, median cubital vein, median cubital vein, right internal jugular vein, right internal jugular vein, brachial vein, brachial vein, basilic vein, basilic vein, radial vein, radial vein, ulnar vein, ulnar vein, dorsal carpal arch, dorsal carpal arch, trapezius muscle, trapezius muscle, supraspinatus muscle, supraspinatus muscle, coracoid process, coracoid process, subscapularis muscle, subscapularis muscle, rib, rib, lung, lung, clavicle, clavicle, coracohumeral ligament, coracohumeral ligament, head of humerus, head of humerus, deltoid muscle, deltoid muscle, scapula, scapula, glenohumeral joint, glenohumeral joint, glenoid, glenoid, teres minor muscle, teres minor muscle, acromioclavicular joint, acromioclavicular joint, acromion of scapula, acromion of scapula, supraspinatus tendon, supraspinatus tendon, glenoid labrum, glenoid labrum, greater tubercle, greater tubercle, glenoid labrum, glenoid labrum, scapula spine, scapula spine, infraspinatus muscle, infraspinatus muscle, teres major muscle, teres major muscle, shaft of humerus, shaft of humerus, deltoid muscle, deltoid muscle, supraspinatus muscle, supraspinatus muscle, coracoid process, coracoid process, pectoralis major muscle, pectoralis major muscle, glenohumeral joint, glenohumeral joint, brachial artery, brachial artery, subscapularis muscle, subscapularis muscle, clavicle, clavicle, acromion of scapula, acromion of scapula, infraspinatus muscle, infraspinatus muscle, teres minor muscle, teres minor muscle, teres major muscle, teres major muscle, glenohumeral ligaments, glenohumeral ligaments, coracobrachial muscle, coracobrachial muscle, biceps brachii muscle, biceps brachii muscle, supraspinatus tendon, supraspinatus tendon, infraspinatus tendon, infraspinatus tendon, head of humerus, head of humerus, shaft of humerus, shaft of humerus, triceps brachii muscle, triceps brachii muscle, clavicle, clavicle, deltoid muscle, deltoid muscle, serratus interior muscle, serratus interior muscle, rib, rib, trapezius muscle, trapezius muscle, supraspinatus tendon, supraspinatus tendon, supraspinatus muscle, supraspinatus muscle, scapula spine, scapula spine, pectoralis major muscle, pectoralis major muscle, coracobrachial muscle, coracobrachial muscle, glenoid labrum, glenoid labrum, subscapularis muscle, subscapularis muscle, lung, lung, biceps brachii tendon, biceps brachii tendon, glenohumeral ligaments, glenohumeral ligaments, head of humerus, head of humerus, glenohumeral joint, glenohumeral joint, glenoid labrum, glenoid labrum, scapula, scapula, infraspinatus muscle, infraspinatus muscle, pectoralis minor muscle, pectoralis minor muscle, surgical neck of humerus, surgical neck of humerus, joint capsule, pectoralis major muscle, pectoralis major muscle, brachial artery and vein and nerve, brachial artery and vein and nerve, teres major muscle, teres major muscle, biceps brachii muscle, biceps brachii muscle, deltoid muscle, deltoid muscle, humerus, humerus, triceps brachii muscle, triceps brachii muscle, breast, breast, brachialis muscle, brachialis muscle, brachioradialis muscle, brachioradialis muscle, brachioradialis muscle, brachioradialis muscle, elbow joint, radius head, supinator muscle, extensor digitorum muscle, triceps brachii muscle, brachialis muscle, trochlea of humerus, ulnar coronoid process, pronator muscle, flexor carpi ulnaris muscle, extensor carpi radialis longus muscle, lateral epicondyle, humeroradial joint, humerus, olecranon fossa, medial epicondyle, humerulnar joint, radial tuberosity, flexor digitorum superficialis muscle, olecranon process, ulna, triceps brachii muscle, olecranon, flexor digitorum profundus muscle, biceps brachii muscle, brachial artery and vein and nerve, brachialis muscle, humerus trochlea, humerulnar joint, pronator muscle, flexor digitorum superficialis muscle, humerus, olecranon fossa, trochlear notch, ulnar coronoid process, ulnar artery and vein, inconius muscle, radius head, humerus, humeroradial joint, brachioradialis muscle, median cubital vein, median cubital vein, brachioradialis muscle, brachioradialis muscle, extensor carpi radialis longus muscle, extensor carpi radialis longus muscle, lateral epicondyle, lateral epicondyle, inconius muscle, inconius muscle, brachial artery and vein and nerve, brachial artery and vein and nerve, brachialis muscle, brachialis muscle, humerulnar joint, humerulnar joint, medial epicondyle, medial epicondyle, triceps brachii tendon, triceps brachii tendon, olecranon, olecranon, humerus, humerus, humerus trochlea, humerus trochlea, extensor carpi radialis brevis muscle, extensor carpi radialis brevis muscle, extensor digitorum muscle, extensor digitorum muscle, ulna, ulna, pronator muscle, pronator muscle, radioulnar joint, radioulnar joint, palmaris longus muscle, palmaris longus muscle, flexor digitorum superficialis muscle, flexor digitorum superficialis muscle, flexor carpi ulnaris muscle, flexor carpi ulnaris muscle, flexor digitorum profundus muscle, flexor digitorum profundus muscle, thumb, thumb, metacarpophalangeal joint, metacarpophalangeal joint, interosseous muscles, interosseous muscles, carpometacarpal joint, carpometacarpal joint, trapezoid, trapezoid, capitate, capitate, scaphoid, scaphoid, wrist joint, wrist joint, radius, radius, phalanges, phalanges, little finger, head of metacarpal bone, head of metacarpal bone, body of metacarpal bone, body of metacarpal bone, base of metacarpal bone, base of metacarpal bone, hamate, hamate, triquetrum, triquetrum, lunate, lunate, ulna, ulna, flexor digitorum tendon, flexor digitorum tendon, distal phalanx, distal phalanx, proximal phalanx, proximal phalanx, head of metacarpal bone, head of metacarpal bone, trapezium, trapezium, brachioradialis tendon, brachioradialis tendon, collateral ligament, collateral ligament, distal phalanx, distal phalanx, middle phalanx, middle phalanx, phalanges, phalanges, proximal phalanx, proximal phalanx, metacarpophalangeal joint, metacarpophalangeal joint, metacarpal bone, metacarpal bone, adductor pollicis muscle, adductor pollicis muscle, flexor pollicis longus tendon, flexor pollicis longus tendon, flexor pollicis brevis muscle, flexor pollicis brevis muscle, metacarpal bone, metacarpal bone, radial artery, lumbrical muscles, lumbrical muscles, flexor digitorum profundus tendons, flexor digitorum profundus tendons, opponens digiti minimi muscle, opponens digiti minimi muscle, abductor digiti minimi muscle, abductor digiti minimi muscle, hamate, hamate, pisiform, pisiform, distal phalanx, distal phalanx, middle phalanx, middle phalanx, phalanges, phalanges, proximal phalanx, proximal phalanx, metacarpophalangeal joint, metacarpophalangeal joint, metacarpal bone, metacarpal bone, extensor digitorum tendon, extensor digitorum tendon, carpometacarpal joint, carpometacarpal joint, capitate, capitate, scaphoid, scaphoid, radius, radius, flexor digitorum tendon, flexor digitorum tendon, adductor pollicis muscle, adductor pollicis muscle, flexor digitorum profundus tendons, flexor digitorum profundus tendons, flexor digitorum superficialis tendons, flexor digitorum superficialis tendons, wrist joint, pronator quadratus muscle, pronator quadratus muscle, dorsal interosseous muscle, dorsal interosseous muscle, palmar interosseous muscle, palmar interosseous muscle, base of metacarpal bone, base of metacarpal bone, extensor carpi radialis brevis muscle, extensor carpi radialis brevis muscle, lumbrical muscles, lumbrical muscles, extensor carpi radialis brevis tendon, extensor carpi radialis brevis tendon, extensor carpi radialis longus tendon, extensor carpi radialis longus tendon, radius, cephalic vein, abductor pollicis longus tendon, abductor pollicis longus tendon, radial artery, flexor carpi radialis tendon, flexor carpi radialis tendon, median nerve, extensor digitorum tendon, extensor digitorum tendon, extensor carpi ulnaris tendon, extensor carpi ulnaris tendon, ulna, radioulnar joint, flexor digitorum profundus tendons, flexor digitorum profundus tendons, flexor carpi ulnaris muscle, flexor carpi ulnaris muscle, ulnar artery, flexor digitorum superficialis tendons, flexor digitorum superficialis tendons, capitate bone, scaphoid, basilic vein, triquetrum, pisiform, trapezoid, metacarpal bone, trapezium, opponent's pollicis muscle, abductor pollicis brevis muscle, abductor pollicis brevis muscle, hamate, capitate, abductor digiti minimi muscle, abductor digiti minimi muscle, hamate hug, dorsal interosseous muscle, cephalic vein, adductor pollicis muscle, metacarpal bone, flexor pollicis longus tendon, abductor pollicis brevis muscle, opponent's pollicis muscle, median nerve, extensor digitorum tendon, base of metacarpal bone, abductor digiti minimi muscle, flexor digitorum profundus tendons, opponens digiti minimi muscle, ulnar artery, flexor digitorum superficialis tendons, adductor pollicis muscle, palmar interosseous muscle, body of metacarpal bone, dorsal digital vein, extensor indicis muscle, collateral ligament, proximal phalanx of thumb, flexor digitorum tendon, lumbrical muscles, head of metacarpal bone, palmar digital arteries, acromioclavicular joint, acromioclavicular joint, acromion of scapula, acromion of scapula, head of humerus, greater tubercle, anatomical neck, surgical neck, lateral border, shaft of humerus, coracoid process, superior angle, clavicle, superior border, glenohumeral joint, subscapular fossa, medial border, inferior angle, lesser tubercle, scapula, scapula spine, infraspinatus fossa, acromion of scapula, lesser tubercle, head of humerus, anatomical neck, surgical neck, shaft of humerus, clavicle, coracoid process, rib, lung, glenohumeral joint, glenoid fossa, superior border, manubrium, body of sternum, superior angle, scapula, inferior angle, clavicle, coracoid process, head of humerus, lung, superior border, rib, costotransverse joint, transverse process, acromioclavicular joint, acromion of scapula, greater tubercle, glenohumeral joint, glenoid fossa, shaft of humerus, scapula spine, acromioclavicular joint, acromion of scapula, clavicle, trachea, thoracic vertebra, coracoid process, head of humerus, glenoid fossa, scapula, rib, costotransverse joint, transverse process, lung, intertubercular sulcus, glenohumeral joint, esophagus, greater tubercle, lesser tubercle, deltoid tuberosity, lateral epicondyle, capitulum, radius, head of humerus, surgical neck, shaft of humerus, coronoid fossa, medial epicondyle, trochlea, ulna, trochlear notch, ulnar coronoid process, supracondylar ridge, olecranon process, acromioclavicular joint, acromioclavicular joint, acromion of scapula, acromion of scapula, head of humerus, greater tubercle, anatomical neck, surgical neck, deltoid tuberosity, shaft of humerus, coronoid fossa, lateral epicondyle, capitulum, clavicle, superior border, suprascapular notch, glenohumeral joint, lung, rip, olecranon process, medial epicondyle, trochlea, ulna, lesser tubercle, ulnar coronoid process, olecranon fossa, trochlear notch, medial epicondyle, coronoid fossa, trochlea, coronoid process, ulna, radial tuberosity, shaft of humerus, lateral epicondyle, capitulum, radial head, radial neck, radius, olecranon process, olecranon fossa, medial epicondyle, coronoid fossa, trochlea, humerulnar joint, coronoid process, radioulnar joint, ulna, radial tuberosity, lateral epicondyle, capitulum, humeroradial joint, radial head, radial neck, radius, olecranon process, coronoid fossa, trochlea, trochlear notch, radial neck, shaft of humerus, olecranon fossa, radial head, olecranon process, ulna, radial tuberosity, coronoid process, metacarpophalangeal joint, metacarpal bone, trapezoid, trapezium, scaphoid, radial styloid process, lunate, radius, capitate, hamate, triquetrum, pisiform, ulnar styloid process, ulnar head, ulna, hook of hamate, sesamoid bone, middle phalanx, distal phalanx, proximal phalanx, sesamoid bone, metacarpal bone, trapezoid, trapezoid, trapezium, trapezium, scaphoid, scaphoid, radial styloid process, radial styloid process, radius, radius, distal interphalangeal joint, distal interphalangeal joint, proximal interphalangeal joint, proximal interphalangeal joint, metacarpophalangeal joint, metacarpophalangeal joint, hamate, hamate, capitate, capitate, pisiform, pisiform, triquetrum, triquetrum, ulnar styloid process, ulnar styloid process, lunate, lunate, ulna, ulna, hook of Hammett, hook of Hammett, metacarpal bone, metacarpal bone, trapezoid, trapezoid, trapezium, trapezium, capitate, capitate, hamate, hamate, triquetrum, triquetrum, pisiform, pisiform, scaphoid, scaphoid, scapula, scapula, humerus, humerus, elbow joint, ulna, ulna, wrist joint, wrist joint, hand, hand, glenohumeral joint, glenohumeral joint, coracoid process, coracoid process, radius, radius, left vertebral artery, left vertebral artery, thyrocervical trunk, thyrocervical trunk, left subclavian artery, left subclavian artery, lateral thoracic artery, lateral thoracic artery, internal thoracic artery, internal thoracic artery, catheter, catheter, costocervical trunk, costocervical trunk, thoracoacromial artery, thoracoacromial artery, axillary artery, axillary artery, posterior circumflex humeral artery, posterior circumflex humeral artery, brachial artery, brachial artery, circumflex scapula artery, circumflex scapula artery, deep brachial artery, deep brachial artery, radial artery, radial artery, brachial artery, brachial artery, ulnar recurrent artery, ulnar recurrent artery, common interosseous artery, common interosseous artery, posterior interosseous artery, posterior interosseous artery, ulnar artery, ulnar artery, radial recurrent artery, radial recurrent artery, radial artery, radial artery, interior interosseous artery, interior interosseous artery, deep palmar arch, deep palmar arch, common palmar digital artery, common palmar digital artery, princeps pollicis artery, princeps pollicis artery, palmar metacarpal artery, palmar metacarpal artery, superficial palmar arch, superficial palmar arch, proper palmar digital artery, proper palmar digital artery, clavicle, clavicle, rip, rip, superior angle, superior angle, glenohumeral joint, glenohumeral joint, scapula medial border, scapula medial border, scapula inferior angle, scapula inferior angle, acromioclavicular joint, acromioclavicular joint, acromion of scapula, acromion of scapula, coracoid process, coracoid process, head of humerus, anatomical neck, anatomical neck, greater tubercle, glenoid fossa, surgical neck, scapula lateral border, shaft of humerus, glenohumeral joint, lesser tubercle, head of humerus, acromion of scapula, greater tubercle, head of humerus, head of humerus, deltoid tuberosity, deltoid tuberosity, shaft of humerus, coronoid fossa, lateral epicondyle, olecranon process, radius, ulna, clavicle, acromioclavicular joint, glenohumeral joint, scapula, medial epicondyle, trochlea, glenohumeral joint, coronoid fossa, lateral epicondyle, capitulum, humeroradial joint, radial head, radius, shaft of humerus, medial epicondyle, trochlea, humerulnar joint, radial tuberosity, ulna, coronoid process, shaft of radius, shaft of ulna, supracondylar ridge, olecranon process, coronoid fossa, lateral epicondyle, capitulum, radial head, radius, lunate, radial styloid process, scaphoid, medial epicondyle, trochlea, radial tuberosity, ulna, ulnar head, ulnar styloid process, triquetrum, pisiform, olecranon process, trochlear notch, shaft of ulna, shaft of humerus, coronoid process, shaft of radius, metacarpophalangeal joint, sesamoid bone, trapezoid, trapezium, capitate, radial styloid process, scaphoid, lunate, radius, metacarpal bone, hamate, pisiform, triquetrum, ulnar styloid process, ulnar head, ulna, distal phalanx, middle phalanx, proximal phalanx, distal interphalangeal joint, proximal interphalangeal joint, metacarpophalangeal joint,